They said money couldn't buy revenge. But what would you call it when the daughter they disowned walked into an Aspen auction and outbid her family by $10 million? My sister froze. My father's smile cracked. My mother whispered, "This can't be happening," but it did. And when I opened the vault in that estate, what I found didn't just ruin their legacy. It erased it. I'm Maddie Vale, and this is how the truth they buried came back with my name on it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The air in Aspen that morning felt like glass, sharp, transparent, ready to break at the slightest sound. I stepped out of the rented SUV, my breath turning white against the cold. Snow dusted the pavement in front of the Ridgecrest auction hall, and for a second I just stood there staring at the tall glass doors, where the wealthiest families in Colorado moved like a stream of glitter and perfume. My reflection looked too plain for the setting. Black wool coat, pulled back hair, dark glasses, but I liked that. Simplicity could make people underestimate you. Inside warmth hit me instantly. The marble floors gleamed like ice, and the air smelled faintly of money, leather gloves, expensive perfume, and confidence. I approached the registration counter, where a young woman with a perfect bun smiled politely. "Name, ma'am," she asked. "Ms. Vale?" Her fingers froze mid-type. The pause was subtle, just one heartbeat too long. She glanced up, eyes narrowing with recognition, then quickly masked it behind professionalism. "Welcome, Ms. Vale. You're cleared for bidding." She slid the paddle across the desk toward me, black with silver numbers. "Thank you," I said. My voice didn't shake, though I could feel the old nerves somewhere deep, buried under years of self-discipline. The sound of laughter drifted from behind me. Light rehearsed, unmistakable. My family had arrived. Catherine entered first, wrapped in a white wool coat that probably cost more than my first apartment. Her heels clicked in perfect rhythm with the confidence she'd practiced her entire life. Behind her came my parents. Richard, tall and silver-haired, his suit cut sharp enough to suggest authority, and Margaret, elegant pearls glowing against her throat. They looked exactly the same as the last time I'd seen them, polished, proud, untouchable. Catherine's eyes landed on me, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing her perfect face before she smiled, sweet as venom. "Oh, look who's here," she announced, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Did you come to clean up the mess?" Maddie conversations paused, heads turned. I didn't move. My mother put a hand dramatically to her chest, pretending shock. "She probably thinks this is a charity auction," she said to no one in particular. My father chuckled, deep and booming. "At least she's consistent." The laughter rolled around me like echoing glass. I said nothing, not a word. I let their voices wash over me, cool and meaningless. A staff member guided us toward the grand room. Crystal chandeliers, rows of velvet chairs, screens displaying the property. Ridgecrest Estate, a mountainside architectural marvel. The auctioneer, a man in his 50s, with a voice like polished stone, took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Today, we begin with Ridgecrest Estate, opening bid at $18 million. Paddles rose almost immediately. 18, thank you. 19. 19.5. The rhythm was hypnotic, like a heartbeat. Catherine lifted her paddle, smiling just enough for the cameras that always found her. My parents looked on with satisfaction, their perfect daughter performing the role of power. I sat 3 rows behind them, still watching. 20, the auctioneer called. 25. Do I hear? 26? Catherine's voice carried across the room. 24. My father murmured something to her. She nodded, confident. The bids climbed higher. 24.2, 24.3, 24.4. Each number seemed to stretch the air thinner. Catherine kept her paddle up, chin tilted, certain no one would dare challenge her. The auctioneer paused. 24.5 million, any advance. The room went still. You could hear the ticking of someone's watch, the faint rustle of silk. I raised my paddle. 25 million, I said clearly. The auctioneer turned, eyebrows arching with pleasant surprise. 25 million from Ms. Vale. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then whispers, a low ripple of curiosity. Do I hear 25.1? No one spoke. Catherine's hand hovered mid-air, trembling slightly before she forced a smile. My father shifted in his seat. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. 25 million going once, the auctioneer said. My pulse steadied. Going twice. Catherine's paddle didn't move. Sold, the auctioneer declared. To Ms. Vale. The gavel struck. 3 sharp beats that echoed through the hall like a verdict. Every head turned toward me. I felt their eyes trace the line of my coat, the stillness of my hands, the calm that didn't belong to someone they once called the disappointment. Catherine whispered something to my mother, her expression twisting. Who the hell is Ms. Vale? She hissed. I stood, collected my paddle, and walked out. The marble floor reflected the light like water. My footsteps sounded too steady to be real. Outside, the cold hit my face like clarity. The wind swept through the valley, carrying laughter from inside that already felt miles away. I paused by the glass doors, looking back once at the hall, at the silhouettes of the family who had taught me silence. I whispered to myself just loud enough to hear over the wind. You wanted me quiet. Now watch what silence can buy. Then I turned, walked into the snow, and didn't look back. The summer heat in Denver felt like it was made to make people shine. The Vale house did. Every lantern, every silver fork, every smile rehearsed to perfection. From the second-floor window, I watched the garden fill with guests. My father's company banners fluttered behind the string lights, his name printed in elegant gold. A jazz trio played near the pool, and the air smelled like champagne and lilies. Catherine was glowing. At 26, she was the kind of daughter you bragged about, tall, beautiful, ambitious, in a way that looked good in photographs. Tonight was her celebration, the scholarship to Parsons in New York. The feature in Denver Life magazine, The Next Vale Legacy. My mother floated beside her pearls, shimmering, introducing her to investors and designers. I stayed by the patio door, a glass of lemonade in hand that I hadn't touched. Sweetheart, smile, my mother said, brushing past me without slowing down. You look like you're at a funeral. It's a bit loud, I said quietly. It's a celebration, she replied, not hearing me already. Turning toward the laughter by the bar, Richard Vale, my father tapped his glass. The music lowered instantly. Everyone turned. He held his champagne up high. Tonight, he said, voice proud and loud, we celebrate Catherine, our family's brightest light. The future of Vale & Co. is in her hands. Applause. Flashes from phones. Catherine blushed in a way that seemed perfectly timed. My throat tightened, but I still clapped. He didn't mention me. After the cheers faded, I stepped forward with an envelope in hand, the one that had arrived 2 days ago. Dad, I said. I got accepted to the University of Colorado. Engineering program. He turned toward me slowly, still smiling for the crowd. Engineering, he repeated, as if it were a foreign word. That's unusual. Catherine laughed softly. She likes taking things apart, she said, her tone sugary, including dinner conversations. A few polite chuckles followed. My father looked at the envelope like it might stain his suit. That's not really a path for women, Maddie. You're smart, but you should focus on something practical. Business, maybe. Or find a stable future, my mother sighed. Please, not now. Don't ruin the mood. I stared at the paper in my hand. The gold seal at the corner caught the light like a promise. Then I folded it back carefully. I didn't think learning how the world works would ruin anything. He frowned. It's not about learning. It's about understanding where you belong. Catherine put a hand on my shoulder, smiling for the guests still half watching us. Don't take it personally. You just have different strengths. Different from what I asked, but she'd already turned away to greet another guest. The jazz music swelled again, drowning the conversation. I felt invisible in the crowd, a prop left on stage after the show ended. When the party finally faded near midnight, I stayed outside by the pool. The floating candles reflected like stars trapped in the water. My mother passed by collecting glasses, her tone tired but sharp. Try not to mope, Maddie. It's Catherine's night. I wasn't moping, I said. Just thinking. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Later in my room, I packed. It didn't take long. 2 pairs of jeans, a few shirts, notebooks filled with half-finished codes, and my old laptop. I counted the cash I had saved from tutoring, $214. Enough for a bus ticket and maybe a week of rent somewhere cheap. The moonlight cut through the blinds, pale across the floorboards. Everything smelled faintly of lavender. The same air freshener my mother insisted made the house feel like success. I looked around the room one last time. There were no photos of me on the walls, only Catherine in graduation robes, Catherine in competitions, Catherine with my parents smiling wide. I slipped my acceptance letter into the backpack. Downstairs, the house was silent, except for the ticking grandfather clock. I hesitated at the front door, hand on the handle, waiting for some part of me to resist. Nothing did. I walked out into the warm night. The cicadas hummed as if they were whispering goodbye. At the end of the driveway, I looked back. The house glowed behind me, gold and hollow, every window lit, but every room empty in a way that mattered. I'm not running away, I whispered to myself. I'm just leaving before they lock the door forever. The next morning, the bus station smelled like burnt coffee and diesel. I bought a one-way ticket with the cash in my hand. The man at the counter looked at me through the scratched glass window. Destination, he asked. Seattle, I said. The bus ride stretched through the mountains, sunlight breaking over the ridges. I pressed my forehead against the glass, the view a blur of trees and freedom. When I finally reached Seattle, the rain greeted me. It soaked through my jacket as I dragged my duffel bag down a narrow street toward a tiny apartment I'd found through an online ad. The walls inside were cracked, the air smelled like damp carpet, and the heater rattled louder than it worked. But there was a desk, a small chipped one by the window. I set my laptop on it, plugged it in, and watched the faint blue light come alive. The fan whirred, the screen flickered, and lines of code from my last assignment appeared. My fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly before finding rhythm again. Outside, the city buzzed, a mix of rain sirens and promise. Inside, for the first time, it was quiet. I started typing, not knowing that this would be the first line of a life that no one in that house would ever understand. By 2019, Seattle had become more than a city to me. It was proof that I could build something from scratch and make it breathe. The office of Vale Solutions looked like a storm had passed through tangled cords, coffee cups, papers scattered across a dozen monitors, and the soft hum of servers that never slept. On the largest screen, a digital map pulsed in shades of red and blue, soil sensors tracking underground contamination near the sound, still chasing ghosts under the ground. Vale, Marcus Hale's voice carried from the doorway. He was in his late 50s, beard trimmed but perpetually uneven. His flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves like a scientist pretending to be casual. I smiled. They're not ghosts. They're signals. We just haven't learned how to listen yet. He grinned, stepping in and looking at the map. We're trying to hear the planet's heartbeat, and you're the only one who seems to have a stethoscope that works. Or maybe I just don't know how to give up, I said, half joking. That too. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. Come on, take a break before you merge with the code. We ended up at the cafe across the street, a place with creaky wooden tables and walls covered in local art. It always smelled like roasted beans and rain. Marcus ordered black coffee. I went for tea because my stomach had learned to fear caffeine. He stirred his cup and leaned back. You ever think about what happens when the truth you dig up isn't what people want to hear? I raised an eyebrow. I work in environmental data, Marcus. No one ever wants to hear it. He smiled faintly. Fair. Still. Keep your vision clean. One day you'll need it to see through the dust people throw at you. I laughed softly, brushing it off. He had a habit of speaking in riddles like he knew something I didn't. Back then, Vale was still small, a handful of engineers, a rented loft above a brewery, and enough optimism to power a city. We built predictive models for soil health and logistics for sustainable construction, and somehow people started noticing. Contracts came in faster than we could process them. In meetings, Marcus would nod at me from across the table, letting me speak even when clients looked past me. Listen to her, he'd say. She built the system you're paying for. That kind of faith could carry you through anything. Then 2021 came, and faith met gravity. The morning of his funeral, the sky opened up like it was morning, too. The rain turned the city into glass. I stood under a shared umbrella with one of his assistants, the wet ground swallowing every sound except the priest's voice. When the crowd thinned, a woman in a dark coat approached me, holding a small envelope and a silver USB drive. Marcus wanted you to have this, she said quietly. He told me to give it to you if anything ever happened to him. My fingers were numb as I took it. The paper inside had only one line written in his uneven handwriting. If anyone ever mentions Ridgecrest, open this. Ridgecrest. I didn't know the name. I didn't ask. I kept the drive in my coat pocket for 3 days before locking it in the safe in my apartment. I didn't open it, not then. Work became my only constant. Terravale grew fast. Too fast, maybe. We expanded from a 6-person startup to a team of 40 within a year. Investors started calling. A European sustainability firm made an offer to buy us out. $15 million. The number didn't feel real. The night after the deal closed, I moved into a high-rise apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. The city lights shimmered on the water, stretching all the way to the horizon. I stood barefoot on the balcony, the wind carrying the salt smell of the sea and the hum of a city that never stopped moving. On the counter behind me sat a half-empty bottle of champagne and the unopened USB drive. I stared at it for a long time, the words from his note looping in my head. If anyone ever mentions Ridgecrest, I didn't know if it was a warning or an invitation. When the clock hit midnight, I poured the rest of the champagne down the sink. I didn't celebrate. Success didn't feel like triumph, it felt like distance. The next day, my inbox filled with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. College professors, former coworkers, journalists wanting quotes about young women changing green tech. Not one from my family. It had been 8 years since I left Denver, and I hadn't spoken to them once. Sometimes I told people they lived abroad. Other times I said nothing at all. I told myself it didn't matter. But every now and then, I'd catch my reflection in the elevator glass and see the same sharp eyes I used to see across my father's dinner table. The same look Catherine had when she wanted to win. That night, sitting alone in the quiet of my new apartment, the city stretching below like circuitry, I thought about that house I left. The laughter, the polite cruelty, the golden cage of expectations. I had everything they said I'd never have success, respect, my own name on the door. And yet some part of me still waited for their voices to fade completely. I leaned back in my chair, watching the rain streak across the window, each drop dragging the city lights into blurred trails. I thought about Marcus's words again. Keep your vision clean. I told myself I'd done it, that I'd left the Vale legacy behind. But the truth, quiet, steady, impossible to ignore, was that the shadow of that name still stretched all the way from Denver to Seattle, and I was still standing in it. The Denver Times headline glowed on my laptop screen like a spotlight aimed straight into the past. Catherine Vale, America's new symbol of modern elegance. Her photo filled the front page, tailored white suit, gold earrings, that same effortless smile she'd practiced since we were kids. The article praised her family values, her visionary taste, her inherited sense of class. I scrolled down each paragraph, twisting tighter inside me. A sidebar featured my father, Richard Vale, shaking hands with a senator beneath a banner that read, Vale Green Fund Gala, investing in a cleaner future. The caption below made me laugh under my breath. Humanitarian of the Year. They were using the word green the way some people use perfume, to hide the rot underneath. The screen flickered as the rain outside Seattle streaked down my window. The skyline glowed in the distance, indifferent, while I sat there in my apartment staring at the family I hadn't spoken to in 13 years. The cursor blinked. I was about to close the browser when a new email appeared in the corner of my screen. From Ethan Brooks. Subject Ridgecrest. I hadn't seen that name in years. Not since Marcus's funeral. My pulse skipped once. I opened it. Ridgecrest Estate is going up for auction. You might want to see the attached file. That was all. No greeting, no signature. Just a single PDF attached. The file opened to a scanned contract, dated 2012, between Vale Industries and a development firm I didn't recognize. Property transfer, Ridgecrest Valley. The location was near the site of the old mining project my father's company had buried, under years of silence and influence. The one the Environmental Protection Agency had tried to audit before the records disappeared. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I reached for my notebook and wrote the word, Ridgecrest. I hadn't seen it written since Marcus Hale had scrawled it on that note the day he died. If anyone ever mentions Ridgecrest, open this. My hand shook slightly as I stood and crossed the room. I opened the safe and took out the silver USB drive. The label on it had faded, but I still remembered the smell of rain from that day. I didn't plug it in. Not yet. Placed it on the table beside the printed contract, and stared at them both. Marcus had known. He always knew when someone was lying through a smile. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. My reflection in the window looked calm, almost detached. But inside, I felt that old ache. The one that came from recognizing my family's name, where it didn't belong. 2 weeks, I thought. That's when the auction would happen. I searched the event page. Ridgecrest Estate. Auction Aspen, Colorado. Open registration for qualified investors. Qualified? That was a word my father had once used to describe people like him, not people like me. The rain turned to mist outside, fogging the glass. I imagined my father's expression when he saw my name appear at that auction. Ms. Vale, LLC, anonymous, professional, untraceable. But this wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about answers. I opened another window, pulled up old EPA records. Most of them were redacted, but the pattern was there. Soil contamination, missing data, an incomplete cleanup report. Every file I read felt like a ghost whispering the same thing: Ridgecrest isn't clean. My phone buzzed. A Seattle contact. An investor congratulating me on TerraVale's latest partnership. I replied with a polite thank you, but my mind was already drawn backward to Denver's manicured lawns and marble lies. My mother would be planning another gala, no doubt. Margaret Vale, in her sequined gown, greeting donors, while pretending not to notice the cracks in her own family. I clicked the next article. There she was, smiling on stage beside Catherine, champagne flute raised. "We're proud to be a family that gives back," she said in the interview. I almost admired how easily she could lie. The truth was, Vale Industries didn't give back. It buried. I printed the auction notice and the contract, sliding them into a folder. Then I booked the flight to Aspen. The confirmation email came instantly, sterile and emotionless. My cursor hovered over the USB drive again. No, not yet. Not until I stood on that ground. I slipped it into my carry-on bag and turned off the lights. The apartment fell into darkness except for the glow from the city below. For the first time in years, the skyline looked less like home and more like a launching pad. As I packed, I thought of the years I'd spent building TerraVale, believing I'd escaped the gravity of that last name. But the truth had a strange orbit. It always came back around. On the counter, my travel folder sat neatly: flight to Aspen hotel reservation, and a new business card. Ms. Vale, Managing Director, Vale, LLC. The alias had been ready for months, created for anonymity during contract negotiations. I hadn't realized I'd one day use it against the people who taught me how to pretend. The rain stopped just before dawn. I stood by the window watching the clouds pull apart over the bay light breaking through the gray. If my family was trying to buy Ridgecrest to bury something, I would make sure that ground never stayed silent again. I reached for the folder, tracing the letters of the estate's name with my thumb. Ridgecrest. Marcus's voice echoed in my memory: "Keep your vision clean." The jet engines outside the airport window roared as my flight was announced. I zipped my bag shut, straightened my coat, and whispered to myself, "If they want to hide it, I'll be the one to bring it to light." Then I walked toward the gate, the printed auction ticket warm in my hand, knowing the next time my last name would echo through a room, it would no longer sound like theirs. The news broke 3 days after the auction. My phone started buzzing before dawn, calls from reporters, texts from numbers I didn't recognize, and a dozen unread emails, with the same headline flashing across every business outlet in Colorado: mystery buyer Ms. Vale purchases Ridgecrest Estate for $25 million. By noon, the mystery wasn't a mystery anymore. Someone from the auction house, someone who apparently enjoyed easy money, had leaked my full name. Ms. Vale is actually Madeline Vale, the estranged youngest daughter of Richard and Margaret Vale. The phrase "estranged youngest daughter" trended on every social feed before breakfast. Family betrayal made the afternoon news cycle. By the time the evening broadcasts rolled around, the narrative was already set. The forgotten daughter returns buying the crown jewel her family couldn't afford. In Denver, my father called an emergency meeting at Vale Industries. I didn't have to be there to imagine it. Catherine throwing the paper across his mahogany desk. My father pacing, hands in pockets, jaw locked. My mother sitting quietly in a tailored suit, her pearls like armor. This was deliberate, Catherine would say, her voice sharp as cut glass. She did this to humiliate us, Richard cold and composed. "We'll sue her. She's not part of this family anymore. She won't use our name to drag us into the gutter." They'd say our name like it was something sacred, not the thing that had crushed me for half my life. The next morning, I was sitting by the window in Ridgecrest Estate when I saw their car pull up the drive. Black SUV, tinted windows. My reflection in the glass didn't move. They didn't call first. They never did. I watched them step out. Catherine, first heels sinking slightly into the gravel. She was dressed like she was attending a press conference, not confronting her sister. My father followed his movements precise, like he'd already decided how the conversation would end. My mother lingered behind them, clutching her purse, her eyes scanning the property like she was seeing it for the first time. The knock at the door was hard enough to echo. I opened it before they could knock again. "Hello, Catherine," I said evenly. "Dad, Mother." My father's eyes flicked over the entryway, marble glass, the framed blueprints still leaning against the wall. "You've made quite the scene," he said. "I didn't make the headlines," I replied. "Your PR team did." Catherine crossed her arms, her perfume hitting me like memory. Sweet, expensive, suffocating. "You did this to embarrass me. To embarrass all of us." "No," I said. "You're giving me too much credit." "I just bought something you wanted." She laughed, sharp and humorless. "Don't pretend this wasn't calculated. You've been waiting years for a chance like this." I stepped aside and gestured toward the sitting room. "Then you should probably sit down. You're going to need energy for the next few minutes." They followed me in. The air inside the house felt colder than outside. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching on the crystal glasses left from the auction reception. Catherine didn't sit. She paced. "You knew we were bidding. You showed up just to outbid us." "I showed up," I said quietly, "because I had the money." "That's not the point," she snapped. My father finally spoke. "You're not entitled to this. You used our last name, our connections, to get where you are. You think you've earned this on your own?" I turned to face him. "I earned everything I have because I didn't use your name." He laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You're still a Vale, whether you like it or not. That name built your foundation. That name almost destroyed me," I said. My mother's hand trembled slightly where it rested on the back of a chair. "Maddie, please. This doesn't have to be ugly. Sell the estate back to us. Let's handle this quietly." I looked at her. Quietly. "That's how we always handled things, right?" Sweep smile repeat. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Catherine slammed her hand on the glass coffee table, the sound cracking through the room. "You think buying this place makes you better than us?" "You're still the same girl who never fit in." I smiled faintly. "You're right. I never fit in, and thank God for that." My father's voice hardened. "You're not worthy of the Vale name." "I know," I said, calm as stone. "That's why I used another." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Catherine's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. The sound of it startled my mother, who whispered, "Enough." For a moment, no one spoke. I walked to the window, looking out toward the snow-covered hills. The light reflected off the glass, and in it I saw their shapes behind me. 3 figures frozen in a room that had belonged to none of us until now. They had come here expecting a fight, but what I saw in their faces wasn't anger anymore. It was fear. They feared losing control, losing the story they'd told the world, losing the illusion that their youngest daughter was still beneath them. "I'm not selling," I said without turning around. "Not now, not ever." Catherine inhaled sharply, the kind of breath people take before they throw a final punch. "You'll regret this." I turned then, meeting her eyes. I already did. For 19 years. My father stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor between us. "You're playing a dangerous game, Madeline." I smiled faintly. I learned from the best. No one moved. My mother's voice, soft and tired, broke the silence. "Richard, let's go." He hesitated, then nodded once. Catherine muttered something under her breath and followed. When the door closed, the echo lingered in the empty hall. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady. Through the window, I watched their SUV drive away, taillights cutting through the fog. I should have felt triumph. But what I felt instead was a strange, heavy quiet, the kind that settles right before a storm breaks. I had thought they would be furious. I hadn't expected them to look terrified, because deep down they already knew what I was starting to suspect. Ridgecrest held something they didn't want me to find, and they were right to be afraid. The morning light in Aspen was a thin, silver wash across the mountains, the kind that made the air look cleaner than it felt. I parked by the front steps of Ridgecrest Estate, the tires crunching against frozen gravel. Steam rose from the hood as I cut the engine. Beside me, Daniel Reed stepped out of his car and zipped his coat up to his chin. "I still can't believe you bought this place," he said, half in admiration, half in warning. "It's beautiful, but it's also enormous." "That's one word for it," I replied, slipping on my gloves. "Haunted is another." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Haunted by what history?" We met the caretaker at the front door. Joe Harper looked like he'd belonged to the house longer than the paint on its walls. 70 years old, weathered face, eyes sharp, despite the years. His keys jingled as he unlocked the heavy double doors. "Place hasn't had a real owner in over a decade," he said, stepping aside for us to enter. "They started renovations back in 2012, then just stopped." "Why?" I asked, glancing around. The foyer opened into a cathedral of light, arched ceilings, grand staircase, dust motes swirling in the cold air. Every sound echoed. Joe hesitated. "Rumor was there were problems with the land. I don't know the details. They just said to seal the lower levels and leave it be." "Problems with the land," Daniel repeated, looking at me. "That's vague," Joe shrugged. "I was told not to ask questions. Just bury it up and move on. Guess they figured some things were better forgotten." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes, and handed me a set of brass keys. "You're the boss now." "Ms. Vale, everything in here belongs to you." The word belongs felt strange in my ears. We started the inspection room by room. The estate stretched across the ridge like a memory someone had tried to erase. Too big, too quiet, too clean in the wrong places. Sunlight cut through tall windows, illuminating layers of dust on furniture that once screamed opulence. In the study, I ran my hand along a shelf lined with old ledgers. The initials R.V. were embossed in the leather spines. I felt a pulse of recognition and disgust. My father's company. "My family's fingerprints." Daniel whistled low. "You realize this could be a PR nightmare if the media ties you to them again." "They already have," I said. "Might as well see what they were hiding." We reached a heavy door at the end of the west corridor, half buried behind a faded curtain. It led down a narrow staircase that smelled of metal and mildew. "Basement," Daniel asked. "Supposedly." The stairs creaked under our boots, the temperature dropping with every step. The air down there was damp thick. The walls were lined with half-finished wiring and rusted pipes. Joe had mentioned sealed sections, and I found one. Steel door chained shut with a broken lock hanging uselessly. "Guess we're not the first to be curious," Daniel muttered, crouching to inspect it. He pulled a small tool from his coat pocket, a habit he'd picked up from years of legal fieldwork. "Mind if I—" "Go ahead." He pried the lock until it gave with a metallic snap. The door groaned open, exhaling a stale draft that smelled faintly of oil and earth. Inside was a small storage room, nothing impressive, until the flashlight beam caught a metallic cabinet in the corner, its surface streaked with rust. Daniel brushed off the dust. "Old filing safe, industrial grade. Probably hasn't been touched in years. Can you open it?" He knelt again, working the latch with the same steady patience he used in court. A few minutes later, the door creaked open with a reluctant sigh. Inside were folders, blueprints, invoices, sealed envelopes. The paper edges were brittle with age. One of the envelopes had Vale Industries stamped in faded ink. I pulled it out, hands trembling despite the cold. The papers inside were engineering documents, soil assessments, chemical orders, and a set of construction permits, all dated 2012. The name of the contractor was familiar. One of my father's subsidiaries. This was one of their sites, I said quietly. "They used Ridgecrest for something." Daniel glanced over my shoulder, or tried to bury it under the renovations. I reached into my bag and pulled out Marcus Hale's USB drive, the one that had waited 3 years for this moment. I plugged it into my laptop, balancing it on a dusty crate. The screen glowed to life, casting a ghostly light on the walls. A folder popped open. Ridgecrest file. Inside, dozens of maps and photographs, soil data cross-referenced with environmental code violations. Marcus had labeled one image Vale Industries discharge zone, 2000. I overlaid it on the estate's property map, the red markers aligned perfectly with where we were standing. "Oh my God," Daniel whispered. "You're saying your father's company dumped waste here?" I zoomed in on the data points, each one tagged with toxin levels. Not just dumped. They sealed it under the foundation. Daniel stared at the glowing map. "If this comes out, it'll destroy them." I looked at him, then back at the screen. "If it comes out, it'll finally be the truth." The silence between us felt electric. I closed the laptop gently and slid it into my bag. Daniel folded his arms. "You're going to go public, aren't you?" "Not yet," I said. "First, I need proof that can't be erased." He nodded slowly, understanding the line I was about to cross. "You realize this isn't just family drama anymore. It's corporate crime. I know exactly what it is. I turned toward the staircase, the cold biting through my gloves as I gripped the railing. At the top of the steps, sunlight spilled through the doorway, blinding after the dim basement. I paused there, letting the warmth hit my face. They thought I'd bought this place to make a statement, to flaunt success. But standing there, smelling the damp earth and chemical residue rising from below, I realized something else entirely. They hadn't feared me because I embarrassed them. They feared me because I might dig deep enough to uncover what they'd buried. And now I had. The new year came without celebration. Snow piled up along the ridge outside the sky, a constant shade of gray that made time blur. Daniel and I turned one of Ridgecrest's upstairs rooms into an office. 2 desks, 4 monitors, and enough caffeine to outlast guilt. The glow from the screens painted everything blue. On one monitor, satellite maps pulsed in layers of color. On another, data from the soil samples we'd sent for analysis scrolled endlessly. The reports were ugly. Daniel leaned over my shoulder, rubbing the back of his neck. Vale Industries buried the 2012 inspection. He said, tapping the screen. The EPA flagged this land for contamination 12 years ago. Then the file vanished. They didn't lose it, I said. They deleted it, he nodded grimly. And now they want to buy back the estate, not for nostalgia, to erase what's left. I sat back staring at the spreadsheet that summarized every toxin we'd found. Cadmium, benzene, mercury. Each name a quiet indictment. They always thought money could bury anything. Not this, Daniel said. Not this deep. We decided to reach out to someone Marcus had once trusted, a retired EPA analyst named Scott Ellis. Daniel tracked him down through an old LinkedIn profile. His reply came in less than an hour. Meet me tomorrow. Not over the phone. The next afternoon, we drove into town and met him at a diner just off Highway 82. He was in his 60s, face lined, but alert. When I slid the printed documents across the table, his jaw tightened. These were never supposed to see daylight again, he murmured. So it's real, I said. He nodded slowly. The Ridgecrest site was one of 3 flagged for illegal dumping by Vale Industries. The EPA report was ready for publication when it was pulled. A week later, your father's company donated a record amount to the department's regional fund. Daniel frowned. And the records transferred, then purged. Someone high up got paid well to make sure of that. He met my eyes. If you're digging this up now, you're going to need protection. They'll come after your name first. When we left the diner, the air outside felt sharper, thinner. Snow crunched beneath our boots as we walked to the car. He's right, Daniel said quietly. They'll hit you through Terravale. They already have a strategy, I said. They always do. I was right. By the next morning, headlines had changed. My phone buzzed nonstop, each notification a new variation of the same lie. Madeline Vale used foreign funds to buy contaminated property, linked to environmental investigation. One anchor called me an opportunist, leveraging green tech for revenge. Another simply asked on live TV, "Is this about justice? Or payback?" Terravale's board called an emergency meeting. The tone was polite but distant. Contracts were temporarily paused, payments under review. I didn't argue. Let them freeze. Daniel stormed into the office with a printout. They're trying to push you into a reaction. Don't give them what they want. I'm not reacting. I said, feeding another stack of papers into the printer. I'm documenting. He watched as I laid the pages across the desk, each one marked with red ink dates, circled signatures highlighted. The sound of the printer filled the room like a clock ticking down. Every invoice, every permit Vale Industries ever filed for Ridgecrest is linked to the same internal code, I said. Project Hale. Daniel looked up. Hale. As in Marcus. I flipped the page. The header read, Project Hale, confidential. My hands went still. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around me. He leaned closer. You think they used his research? I didn't answer. I was already searching the file system, opening folder after folder. There it was again. His name buried in subcontracts, research proposals, environmental algorithms. Marcus Hale hadn't just worked with them. His data had built the foundation for Vale Industries' Clean Energy Initiative, the same one that had justified their dumping in 2012. He must have discovered it, I whispered. That's why they silenced him. That's why he warned me, Daniel exhaled, sitting back hard. Maddie, if that's true, you're sitting on evidence of corporate manslaughter. I'm sitting on proof. I said, my voice steady even though my pulse wasn't. Proof they used his work to poison this land, then killed his reputation to protect theirs. For a long moment we said nothing. Outside, the snow fell in a steady white curtain, muffling the world. Daniel broke the silence first. So what now? Now we gather everything before they destroy it. We spent the next 12 hours combing through data, cross-referencing Marcus's algorithms with Vale Industries' project codes, copying every digital trace onto encrypted drives. The printer whirred until it overheated the air thick with paper dust and tension. At midnight, I stretched my stiff fingers and looked at the pile of evidence on the table, hundreds of pages that could unravel decades of deceit. Daniel rubbed his eyes. They'll come after you harder now. You know that, right? They already are, I said softly. They just don't know I've stopped hiding. I packed the files into folders, labeling each one with a date. My handwriting was slow, deliberate, grounding me. When I came to the final document, I hesitated. Marcus's name appeared again, faint but clear. Lead Environmental Consultant Project Hale, 2011-2012. A bitter ache rose in my throat. The man who had taught me to listen to the earth had been buried by the same people who'd taught me to stay silent. I closed the folder carefully and placed it at the top of the stack. That night, as Daniel left for his hotel, I stayed behind, unable to turn off the light. The blue glow from the monitors flickered across the papers like water over stone. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about Ridgecrest. It wasn't just about me or them. This was about the truth Marcus had spent his life trying to protect. I thought I was uncovering my family's corruption, but the name on that file told me otherwise. I wasn't just investigating them anymore. I was walking straight into the secret of the man who had taught me everything I knew. The wind outside Ridgecrest sounded like it was trying to claw its way through the walls. It was the kind of winter night when silence carried weight, too heavy, too aware. I was sorting through files in the study when I heard 3 faint knocks against the front door. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks. Then the second set came softer, but certain. When I opened the door, the cold rushed in, and standing there wrapped in a gray wool coat dusted with snow was my mother. Mom, I said quietly, the word catching on my breath. She looked smaller, somehow older than I remembered. Her lipstick was faded, her hands bare despite the cold. Madeline, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know where else to go. I stepped aside. Come in. The door closed behind her with a hollow click. She stood there for a moment, staring at the grand staircase, her eyes scanning the room, as if the house itself might judge her. You look different, she said finally. Stronger. So do you. I replied, just in another way. She didn't smile. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small dented metal box. It was covered in dust edges, rusted. I can't keep this anymore, she said, holding it out to me. It doesn't belong to me. I hesitated before taking it. The metal was ice cold against my palms. What is it? Something I should have given you a long time ago. We moved into the living room, the fire burning low in the hearth. The flames threw gold light across her face, deepening every line I hadn't noticed before. I set the box on the table between us and unlatched it carefully. Inside was an old external hard drive, a few crumpled papers and a photograph. 2 men standing side by side in front of a construction site. One of them was my father. The other was Marcus Hale. My chest tightened. Where did you get this? Her hands were shaking. It was hidden in your father's study. He kept it locked away, after the auction, after everything. I started to wonder what else he'd kept from us. She paused, as if gathering courage she didn't have much of. Richard forced Marcus to sign a falsified report in 2013, a statement that cleared Vale Industries of all responsibility for the Ridgecrest contamination. Marcus refused at first. I stared at her, the firelight flickering across the edges of the photo. He refused. She nodded. Your father threatened him. Said if he didn't sign, he'd ruin his career, his credibility, everything. And when Marcus still said no, Richard found another way. The words felt heavy in the air, like they'd been waiting years to be spoken. I reached for the hard drive, tracing the scratched label. Marcus knew, I whispered. That's why he left me the file. He wanted me to finish what he couldn't. My mother looked down at her hands, pale against the reflection of the fire. I watched him change after that. He stopped coming to our events, stopped returning calls. Your father said he was unstable. I believed him. Her voice broke. I believed him, Maddie. For a long time, the only sound was the fire crackling between us. Then she said, almost to herself, I thought silence was protection. I thought if I kept quiet, I could keep our family intact. But silence doesn't protect anyone. It just poisons everything it touches. I reached across the table and took her trembling hand. You don't have to carry it anymore, I said softly. You did what you thought you had to. Tears slipped down her cheeks. No. I did what was easy. And easy is not the same as right. We sat there for a long time, two women bound by the same name, but finally speaking the same truth. The snow outside fell heavier, muting the world until it felt like we were the last two people left in it. When the fire burned low, she stood wiping her eyes. You're not going to stop, are you? I shook my head. I'm not doing this for revenge, Mom. I'm doing it because someone has to. She looked at me, her expression a mix of fear and pride. Then do it differently. Don't let it consume you the way it consumed him. She reached out, touching my cheek the way she hadn't since I was a child. You can't save your father, she said quietly. But you can save yourself. Her words cut through the room like glass breaking in slow motion. I walked her to the door. The snow outside had thickened, falling in silent sheets that glowed under the porch light. She paused on the steps, her breath visible in the cold. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, but I hope one day you'll understand why I stayed silent. I looked at her, the wind tugging at her coat. I already do, but understanding doesn't erase the damage. She nodded once, accepting it. Then she turned and walked into the storm, her figure fading into white until she was gone. I closed the door slowly and leaned against it, the quiet pressing close again. The metal box sat on the table, the hard drive inside blinking faintly, a single light alive after all those years. I carried it to my desk and set it down beside Marcus's old USB. The two drives pulsed together, their tiny lights reflecting in the glass of the window like two steady heartbeats against the dark. There are apologies that don't need words. They live in the shaking hands that finally give back the truth. And in that moment, holding the evidence of everything they'd buried, I knew that the silence that had built this family was finally irreversibly broken. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand, vibrating against the wood like a trapped insect. I didn't have to look to know what it was. The world doesn't stay quiet for long when the Vale family bleeds in public. On the screen, every headline screamed the same thing. Catherine Vale breaks down in tears. My sister is destroying this family out of jealousy. I watched the video soundless at first. Catherine sat beneath a wall of flashing cameras, her hair styled perfectly, eyes red at the edges, but artfully so. She dabbed a tissue beneath her lashes like she'd rehearsed the motion in a mirror. My sister has always struggled with resentment, she said, her voice quivering just enough to sound human. But this has gone too far. She's attacking our family, twisting stories to hurt the people who have loved her all along. And then came my father standing beside her in his dark suit, hands clasped like a politician's. His tone was steady, controlled. We will be filing a lawsuit against Madeline Vale for defamation, data theft, and breach of corporate confidentiality. This is a painful moment, but truth must prevail. A perfect performance. The camera flashes painted their faces in white light, like they were saints on trial, instead of sinners in disguise. Across every news ticker, two words began to loop. Vale versus Vale. Daniel burst into the office at Ridgecrest an hour later, holding a cup of coffee and his phone. You've seen it. Of course, I said. The video replayed silently on one of the monitors, Catherine's tears looping endlessly. They'll drag you into court, he warned. Every file, every transaction, they'll twist it until you look like the villain. I expected that. He exhaled, setting his coffee down. Are you ready for that kind of war? I looked up at him. I was raised in that kind of war. He didn't argue. He just nodded, pulling out his laptop as I turned back to the metal box my mother had given me. Inside, beneath the photo and documents I'd already seen, was another file folder labeled Financial Correspondence 2012 to 2014. The edges were yellowed, the ink faded, but legible. I flipped through each page carefully until a line of numbers caught my eye. Wire transfers from Vale Industries to a shell corporation named Clear Earth Solutions, LLC. Fake disposal firm. Daniel murmured, scanning the header over my shoulder. Not just fake, I said. Look at the dates. They match the exact week Ridgecrest's renovation permits were approved. The dots connected so easily it was almost insulting. My father had used his own cleanup budget to funnel money into fake operations, paying contractors to remove toxins that never left the soil. Then they'd buried everything, literally and figuratively. Gotcha, Daniel muttered under his breath. I opened my laptop, connected the old hard drive, and copied the files. There was only one person I trusted with evidence this explosive. Lauren Kim, a journalist who had been blacklisted 5 years ago after pushing too hard on an EPA cover-up that looked suspiciously similar to this one. She'd built her reputation on stubborn truth, the kind that doesn't sell easily but endures. Her number was still saved in my contacts. When she answered, her tone was cautious. Maddie Vale. I never thought I'd get that call. I have something, I said simply. Documents, transfers, evidence of corporate pollution covered up by Vale Industries. It connects to Ridgecrest. There was a pause, then a faint exhale. You're aware your family's suing you, right? I am. You release this, and you'll never have privacy again. You'll be the woman who took down her own bloodline. Are you ready for that? I stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop, the rows of numbers glowing like quiet confessions. Justice doesn't need to look good, Lauren. It just needs to exist. Another pause, then. Send it. I'll verify before I publish. When the call ended, I felt something shift. Not relief, not fear, just inevitability. I uploaded the files to a secure drive and encrypted the link before sending it. Then I sat back watching the snow swirl against the glass. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the heater, but beneath that calm, I could feel the storm gathering. Somewhere in Denver, they were already preparing their next move. That night, I didn't have to imagine it. In a boardroom high above the city, Catherine sat beside my father, her expression tight. No tears this time. If this goes public, we lose everything she said, investors' reputation. Even the Green Fund, Richard didn't flinch. Then it can't go public. There's someone I know, Catherine said after a moment. A data consultant. He can erase digital records, cleanly. If we wipe her drives before the journalists verify, they'll have nothing. My father's eyes hardened. Do it. Before she moves first. Outside, the Denver skyline shimmered in the night. Cold, bright, and blind. Back in Aspen, I sat in the glow of my monitors, unaware of the calls being made hundreds of miles away. My laptop hummed as I encrypted backup after backup, each one labeled under false names. Daniel came into the room quietly. You sent it, didn't you? Yes. He rubbed his temples. Then we're officially past the point of no return. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked out the window at the ridge beyond the snow, catching the faint orange of the sunrise breaking through the clouds. I spent years hiding from their shadow, I said. But shadows only exist because something stands in the light. He watched me for a long moment. You know what's coming, right? I said, and I'm done running from it. I turned off the last monitor and stood by the window. The snow outside glowed gold in the dawn, the house humming with the energy of what was coming. They thought I would disappear, that I'd fold under pressure hide like before. But they were wrong. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where they feared I'd be, standing in the one place they could never survive. In the open, in the light. The courthouse smelled faintly of rain and metal when the doors opened. Reporters crowded the marble steps, cameras flashing like lightning against the gray June sky. Someone shouted my name, another called it betrayal. The noise didn't touch me. My heels clicked steadily against the floor as I walked in beside Daniel, the air humming with tension. Inside the Federal Court of Colorado was colder than I expected. Clean, symmetrical, detached. The name Vale versus Vale was printed on the docket, black ink on white paper, as if it could contain the years that had led here. Ready, Daniel murmured. I adjusted the cuff of my blazer. As I'll ever be. The courtroom was full. Journalists, activists, half the Denver business elite, pretending they didn't know which side to support. At the plaintiff's table, my father sat. Rigid, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression unreadable. Catherine was beside him, her face pale under the camera lights. mascara too precise to hide the nerves beneath it. My mother wasn't there. The judge entered. All rise. We did. Judge Eleanor Whitmore was known for her patience and her precision. Her presence silenced the room instantly. This court is now in session for Vale Industries versus Madeline Vale, she said. Charges include unauthorized access to proprietary data defamation and release of confidential materials. Defense may begin when ready. Richard's attorney rose first smooth and rehearsed. Your Honor. The defendant acted with malicious intent, unlawfully obtaining company files and distributing false claims to the media, resulting in significant financial and reputational damage to Vale Industries. Every word slid across the room like oil. Then Daniel stood. Your Honor. He began calm, but sharp. My client did not steal information. She uncovered it. Records that Vale Industries deliberately concealed documents proving illegal dumping and falsified reports tied directly to federal environmental violations. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Judge Whitmore lifted a hand. Proceed with evidence. Daniel clicked the remote. The courtroom lights dimmed. On the screen behind us, a scanned contract appeared. Vale Industries letterhead signatures at the bottom. The projector's hum filled the silence. This, Daniel said, is the falsified environmental compliance report from 2013. It carries the signature of Dr. Marcus Hale, former consultant for Vale Industries, and of Mr. Richard Vale. He stepped forward, tapping the screen. As this document will show, Dr. Hale's signature was forged. My client possesses the original digital file from Vale's servers recovered from a hard drive provided by Mrs. Margaret Vale. A ripple went through the room like a held breath snapping. The camera flashes started again. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. My father didn't move. His eyes locked on the screen, the muscle in his jaw twitching once, twice. Judge Whitmore looked up. Mr. Vale, are you confirming or denying the authenticity of this document? Richard's lips parted, but no sound came out. He swallowed, cleared his throat. I was advised to sign off based on information from my compliance team. I did not forge anything, Daniel pressed. But you approved it knowing Dr. Hale refused to falsify results. That's not true, Richard snapped too quickly. Daniel turned to the clerk. Permission to display Exhibit 17. The next slide appeared a series of wire transfers, signatures, and an internal email chain. The room shifted a collective exhale. These are payments made to Clear Earth Solutions, a shell company registered to a Vale Industries subsidiary. Funds were directed to cover soil restoration at Ridgecrest, a project never completed. Whitmore leaned forward. Mr. Vale, were you aware this company did not exist? Richard hesitated. For the first time in my life, I saw something crack in him. Not anger, not denial, but panic. Catherine reached for his arm, whispering, Dad, stop talking. But it was too late. Daniel's voice was calm, merciless. Your Honor. We request these documents be entered into public record alongside the Ridgecrest file. Data collected from the Environmental Protection Agency confirming toxic chemical burial beneath the estate. The judge turned to the clerk. So ordered. The words hit the room like a gavel before the actual one did. My father's shoulders sagged. The cameras flashed again, white light cutting across his face like a verdict before the court even gave one. Catherine's composure shattered. She stood abruptly, whispering something I couldn't hear, then hurried out the side door. The reporters followed her with their lenses like vultures tracking movement. Judge Whitmore looked down at her notes. Given the evidence presented, this court finds sufficient grounds to compel full disclosure of Vale Industries' environmental records, including all financial and regulatory correspondence from 2011 to 2010, until reviewed all assets associated with the company are frozen. A gasp rippled through the gallery. The judge looked directly at me. Ms. Vale, this proceeding is adjourned pending final review. The truth will speak for itself. The gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. The courtroom erupted, reporters rushing for the door, lawyers gathering papers, the sound of chaos wrapped in relief. I stood still for a moment, everything slowing around me. Daniel touched my arm. You did it. No. I said quietly, my eyes still on my father. The truth did. He was still sitting there staring at the table, as if the grain of the wood might offer forgiveness. For a long moment, I thought he'd look up. He didn't. As we left, the flashes followed us down the hall. Outside, the air smelled like summer rain, heavy and clean, washing away the remnants of winter. That night, the news broadcasted the outcome live. The anchor's voice echoed through the nearly empty conference room of Vale Industries as Richard sat alone under fluorescent light. The reporters had gone. The empire was crumbling. He watched the screen in silence. The words, Vale investigation. Federal inquiry underway. Scrolling across the bottom. After a long pause, he reached for his wedding ring, twisted it once, and set it down on the table beside a half-empty glass of water. The metal clicked softly against the wood. Some endings don't come with shouting. They arrive quietly, when the lies finally stop echoing and the only sound left is the truth settling into place. I didn't win, because I wanted revenge. I won because there was nothing left for them to hide. It only took a few weeks for the world to devour the empire that had taken decades to build. Every major outlet carried the same headline, Vale Industries faces federal indictment for environmental fraud. CEO Richard Vale could serve up to 15 years. The news anchors read the words with the same careful cadence they once used to praise him. Stock tickers bled red across the bottom of every screen. The same faces that used to smile beside him at charity dinners now avoided cameras, their donations quietly redirected. I watched one of the reports from my kitchen in Seattle, the soft hum of the city outside the window. On the screen, my father was being led into a federal courthouse, his wrists hidden under the cuffs of his tailored suit. The camera zoomed in as he adjusted his tie with shaking hands, a small, pointless gesture of control. Across the city, my phone buzzed nonstop with messages from journalists, invitations to interviews, offers for book deals. I ignored them all. Karma had never needed an audience. Catherine's fall came faster. Her lifestyle brand dissolved in less than a month. Sponsors pulled out, investors demanded refunds, and the social media she'd built her identity around turned on her overnight. I saw one photo of her on a gossip site, standing on a Denver street corner surrounded by paparazzi. Mascara streaked down her face. She was holding her phone like it could still save her. The caption read, "From luxury to lawsuit. Catherine Vale breaks down in public." I scrolled past it. I didn't feel satisfaction, not really. Just a kind of quiet release, like air leaving a room that had been sealed too long. My mother, true to her word, vanished from the spotlight entirely. She sold the Denver house and moved to a small adobe home outside Santa Fe. The press called it a retreat for health reasons. I knew better. Sometimes retreat is the only way to survive what truth leaves behind. Daniel came by one evening, a rare smile on his face. "The prosecutors have what they need," he said. "You can finally rest." I poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. Rest isn't really my thing. I said, "Justice doesn't rest. It just changes shape." He laughed softly. "Then what shape is it now?" I looked out the window at the skyline, the cranes building new things over the old. Maybe this. When the invitation came from Washington, D.C., for me to speak at the Green Innovation Summit, I hesitated. It felt strange standing where Marcus should have stood, where my father once wanted to. But I went anyway. The hall was packed. Scientists, students, policymakers, the kind of people who still believed data could change the world. When I stepped up to the podium, the room hushed. The lights were bright, almost blinding. I took a breath. "I've been asked what silence means to me," I began. For years I thought silence was weakness, the thing that let powerful people bury truth and call it protection. But I've learned something else. I looked up at the rows of faces watching me. Silence, when used with purpose, isn't submission. It's strength. It's the space where courage gathers before it speaks. There was a pause. Then the applause came. Soft at first, then rising, until it filled the hall like a tide. I caught Daniel's eye in the crowd. He nodded once. The applause went on long enough for me to close my eyes and let it wash through me. Not pride, not victory, just peace. Afterward, reporters waited outside the venue microphones, ready, asking the same questions. What does justice feel like? What do you want to say to your family? Do you forgive them? I didn't stop. I just smiled politely and walked past the flash of cameras trailing behind me like fading stars. That night, back in my hotel room, I wrote one email to Lauren Kim. "Lauren, thank you. The truth was heard because you weren't afraid to listen. M." I hit send, closed the laptop, and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was warm, the city glowing beneath me. Somewhere far away in a dim federal courtroom, my father sat behind bars awaiting sentencing. In another corner of Denver, Catherine deleted her accounts one by one, her online empire collapsing into silence. And in Santa Fe, my mother tended a garden under the desert sun, finally living in the quiet she had once feared. Lauren's article won an award that month. Exposé of the Year. The photo that ran beside it showed me standing at the podium in Washington mid-sentence, my hand raised as if reaching toward something invisible. The caption read, "The woman who unburied the truth." I didn't recognize myself in it. Maybe that was the point. The next morning I woke early and stepped out onto the balcony again. The sky over Disk was still dark, the first light beginning to spill over the horizon. The mountains were a faint memory in the distance, but I could still feel their weight. The ghosts of Ridgecrest, Denver, all of it fading behind me. Karma doesn't knock. It walks straight through the door you once slammed on someone else. I watched the sunrise climb higher, the gold light washing over the city until it touched my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing in anyone's shadow. The world was quiet, clean, and wide open. Spring came late to Aspen that year, as if the mountains themselves were waiting for permission to thaw. 1 year had passed since the trial, and Ridgecrest no longer looked like the place where my family had buried their sins. The gates now read a different name, the Hale Center for Environmental Innovation. Where the soil had once been poisoned, young trees now stretched upward, their roots clean, their leaves bright against the still melting snow. Inside the restored estate, the rooms no longer echoed with silence. They pulsed with life. Keyboards clicking, laughter spilling down the hallways, voices trading ideas faster than the wind outside could carry them. I walked through the main corridor with Olivia Grant, a 28-year-old researcher and the first recipient of the Hale Fellowship. She was everything I used to be. Sharp, curious, a little uncertain about her place in a world built to overlook women who think too loudly. She adjusted her glasses as we passed one of the new labs. "I used to think only people with power could change the world," she said, watching a team of students gather around a solar purification prototype. I smiled. "No," I said. "It's the ones who speak when everyone else stays silent. That's how the world shifts." We stopped at the glass wall overlooking the grounds. The snow had begun to recede, revealing the stream that wound through the property. It glimmered under the afternoon sun, clear and alive. A year ago, that same earth had been toxic. Now it fed wildflowers. Olivia turned toward me. "It's hard to believe this used to be, poisoned," I said softly. She nodded. "That's the thing about truth," I said. "It can rot underground for years, but once it breathes, it grows." She smiled at that, and for a moment I saw what Marcus Hale must have seen in me all those years ago. The spark of someone still learning what power really meant. We continued walking until we reached the grand atrium. A new skylight had been built where the old ceiling had collapsed, flooding the space with light. At the center stood a bronze plaque beneath a framed photograph of Marcus, his easy grin frozen in time, the wind ruffling his hair. Beneath it, carved in silver, "Truth never dies in silence." I stood there for a long time, staring up at him. "We did it," I whispered. In the reflection of the glass, I caught Olivia watching me with quiet respect. I nodded toward the photo. "That's the man who taught me everything worth knowing." She smiled. "Then I guess he's still teaching us." Later that afternoon, I sat in my new office, a space that had once been my father's private study. The walls had been stripped and repainted, the heavy drapes replaced with open windows. The air smelled like pine and rain. On my desk lay a letter in my mother's handwriting. I opened it slowly. "My dear Madeline, I've watched the news from afar, but I wanted you to hear this from me. I am proud, not because you won, but because you broke the silence I was too afraid to break. You turned the place that held our worst secrets into one that creates light. That is what real redemption looks like. Love, Mom." Her words blurred for a second before I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer beside Marcus's USB. Two ghosts resting side by side, both finally at peace. Outside, the students were gathering near the courtyard for the first spring symposium. Daniel stood among them, sleeves rolled up, talking to a group of engineers about renewable data mapping. He caught my eye and gave a small, knowing wave before turning back to the group. It struck me then How much had changed. The house no longer belonged to the Vales or to their lies. It belonged to the future, to the people unafraid of digging for the truth even when it's buried deep. I walked out onto the balcony that overlooked the ridge. The air was crisp, the last traces of snow melting into streams that shimmered through the pines. From here I could see the entire valley, the same view my father once called his legacy. He was wrong. Legacies aren't inherited. They're rewritten. As I walked down the stone path toward the stream, I saw Olivia standing by the edge of the water, snapping photos of the rebuilt labs behind her. She turned and waved. I waved back, the sunlight flashing through the trees between us. When they laugh at you, I said quietly to no one in particular, stay silent, because a few minutes later, they'll become the lesson. The wind carried my words away, gentle and sure. Where there had once been poison, there was now motion. Where there had once been silence, there was purpose. The truth had done what revenge never could. It had set me free. Somewhere in the distance, the bells from the new research hall chimed the hour. I turned toward the sound, my steps steady, my shadow stretching ahead in the late afternoon light. If you've ever been dismissed, belittled, or made to feel small, remember this. Your silence isn't empty. It's gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to be heard. And when it finally speaks, it won't whisper. It will echo.